yes, the criteria could be used to establish positively reliable information about what Mary thought. But if the traditions are only singly attested or not dissimilar, then all you can say is, we can't prove these to be reliable. But that doesn't prove that they're unreliable. So this is just one illustration of this constant use or misuse by Bart Ehrman of the criteria in an illegitimate negative way. Now let's look more specifically at some of the specific criteria. First, the criterion of independent attestation. Let me give you some examples of his misuse of this criterion. He gives a study question, number 1, to his students. Pick 2 events, one provable, one not, by independent attestation. What is the difference in the evidence? Notice this is a misuse of the criterion because it's comparing 2 events rather than one event. The criterion only applies to one event, not to 2. And so it's a misuse of the criterion. Another example, he says, or rather he admits that the virgin birth passes the criterion of independent attestation. It's found in both Matthew and in Luke's gospel, and these are independent of each other. So the virgin birth passes the criterion of independent attestation, but Ehrman complains, well, it's not more widely attested, and therefore he denies its historicity. Well, that's misusing the criterion again. It is independently attested. That counts in favor of its historicity, and in any case, you can't use it negatively to deny historicity. Or again, the birth in Bethlehem passes the criterion of independent attestation. We have independent accounts in Matthew and Luke that Jesus was born in Bethlehem. But again, Ehrman complains about a lack of more sources and says there are secondary inconsistencies in the narrative, and therefore we can't know Jesus was born in Bethlehem, which is simply a failure to apply consistently the criterion of independent attestation. Another example, he argues against the historicity of the trip to Bethlehem by Joseph and Mary because it's not multiply attested. That's an illegitimate use of the criterion. Just because it's not multiply attested, you can't infer that it's unhistorical. Or finally, he rejects Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem despite the fact that it is multiply and independently attested in Mark's gospel and in John's gospel. Why? Well, he rejects it because it's not dissimilar. But that's denying both the criterion of independent attestation and misusing dissimilarity in a negative way. So these are just some examples of his misuse of the criterion of independent attestation. What about the criterion of dissimilarity? Well, here are some illustrations of his misuse of this criterion. He says, some traditions may strike us as suspect in view of the criterion. That's impossible because the criterion can only be used positively to show that something is likely to be historical because it is dissimilar. If it's not dissimilar, that gives no reason to think it's suspect. Or another example, he says it casts a shadow of doubt on certain traditions in the Gospel of Thomas. Again, that's using the criterion negatively. You cannot use the criterion to cast doubt on certain traditions, only to establish them. Another example, he says, sources for the virgin birth have a vested interest in the doctrine, and so it doesn't pass the criterion. Well, this confuses dissimilarity with vested interest. Just because they have a vested interest in believing in the virgin birth doesn't mean that the story of the virgin birth isn't dissimilar. In fact, the story of the virgin birth is radically dissimilar to antecedent Judaism and paganism. Contrary to what you hear on the internet, the fact is that there are no parallels to the virgin birth in pagan religions in the ancient Near East. The stories of divine human offspring of a god and a human female in ancient mythology were not virgin birth stories. They were stories of the God coming down from heaven and physically having sexual intercourse with a human woman and impregnating her so that she bears a child that is then a divine human being like Hercules. But there's nothing in pagan mythology or antecedent Judaism that is similar to the virgin birth story of Jesus, which is emphatically not a story of a God coming down from heaven in human form and copulating with a human female. So it is dissimilar, in fact, as well as multiply attested. He says the story of the wise men doesn't pass the criterion of dissimilarity because it has theological purposes. But again, failure to pass the criterion doesn't show that it's unhistorical. That's just a confusion. He denies Jesus' passion predictions because they're not dissimilar. That, again, is a misuse of the criterion. Just because something is not dissimilar doesn't mean it's unhistorical. He denies the crowds calling for Jesus' crucifixion because that's not dissimilar. But again, that's to use the criterion negatively rather than positively. Finally, he denies the 30 pieces of silver for which Judas betrayed Jesus because it's not dissimilar. But once again, you can't judge a narrative to be unhistorical because it's not dissimilar. So I think you can see over and over and over again he misuses the criteria of authenticity. Finally, what about the criterion of contextual credibility? Remember I said that this criterion properly stated can be used to establish historicity by showing its context. Now here Ehrman, I think, actually uses the criterion properly, but it's contrary to his misstatement of it. His misstatement was, remember, a negative misstatement that you use it to exclude historicity, and yet he argues Jesus spoke Aramaic because it makes sense contextually. He argues Jesus was an apocalypticist because of contextual credibility. He argues that the title, the Son of Man, is an authentic expression used by Jesus because it is contextually credible. And he argues that Jesus was an exorcist because that's contextually credible. Those are all proper use of the criterion. Positive arguments on the basis of the criterion. But you remember, that wasn't the way he stated the criterion. He stated the criterion negatively to say that if something wasn't contextually credible, then it was unhistorical. So here, ironically, he winds up using the criterion correctly, positively, because he abandons his own misstatement of it. So I think you can see that when you look at Ehrman's statement of and use of the criteria, this is really a disaster. It's really an embarrassment that a New Testament scholar should be this sloppy.